This is Ocean Wings, where Monterey magic leads to meaningful change. Hosted by me, ocean advocate Martina Wing, join us as we explore how nature can reconnect us to what really matters in life. Together, let's dive into how each of us can truly make a difference at this critical time for the environment and our world, and how we can transform awe and wonder into action, conservation, courage, healing, and purpose. Welcome to another episode of the Ocean Wings podcast. It's a wonderful opportunity to talk to someone I talked to already, and her name is Dawn Murray. And she does amazing work and is involved in many wonderful projects. So welcome, Dawn.
Thank you so much for having me.
A few weeks ago, we sat down and we were actually, the task was here to interview me. So it was a lot of talking about me. And today we're going to turn the tables and it's all about you. And but we were really geeking out about the manta rays. And that connection was formed because you were a customer of our tour. And there was some time before that when you inquired. But this is the connection we created. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. So when I look at your resume, I mean, it's a mind-blowing resume. And I introduce you as Dawn Murray, but I should have said Professor Dawn Murray. So why don't we dive in for all the listeners? Maybe you have young people in your life that want to go down exactly this path. How did your career started? And tell us about it.
Yes. Oh, thank you for asking. Well, I always tell my students that there are many different paths to where they might want to go. So I think I'm a good example of that. I was born and raised in Santa Barbara, California, but my dad was actually drafted in the Korean War, and he got to choose between Hawaii or Greenland, and he chose Hawaii. So he and my mom moved there. He was stationed there, Tripler Army Hospital, and they had my older sister there. And so Hawaii, for these two people who had been born and raised in Boston, was, a world away. And they fell completely in love with it. So when my dad ended up getting out of the Army and they came to California, to Los Angeles, for him to work, they drove up one day to Santa Barbara and decided to stay. But Hawaii was always part of their, they had been there for so long, it was always part of their rapport and their kind of feeling of home. And so we would go growing up quite often to visit friends and various islands and places that were special to them. So I think I just was lucky enough to be raised in a coastal town, and during the summer go to another coastal area where I just fell completely in love with the ocean. Everything from the fish to the invertebrates to the mammals to how things worked. I think maybe annoyingly so, I just always had questions of how and why, and started really focusing on being out in nature for my free time. That became my place of sanctuary and solace. The ocean and the magic of the creatures and just the expansiveness of the ocean was really mesmerizing for me. But life, took turns. I didn't have a great high school biology teacher that was very inspiring. I thought maybe I shouldn't do that. I started studying art history and Italian and really enjoying our Italian roots and ancestry. So I took Italian. I was first an art history Italian major in college, and kind of accidentally started taking some biology classes at UC Santa Cruz. We had a great way of taking, choosing what you're taking each quarter, and it was called shopping for classes. So you could go to every class that first week and kind of decide what you wanted to take. And I always tended to land in these biology, oceanography, invertebrate ecology classes. So I changed my major after 2 years to marine science. But I didn't want to leave, the art history behind. So I still did some of that. And then I started taking geology and loved that. Changed my major again. Took 5 years in undergraduate to kind of do a senior thesis on jellyfish. They had just opened an exhibit at the Monterey Bay Aquarium on jellyfish. And I was fascinated with these creatures. It was really the first exhibit with jellies, I think in the nation, focused on these invertebrates. And while a lot of my classmates wanted to study, whales and dolphins, and I also really enjoyed these small things that we just knew very little about. One of my favorite classes was this invertebrate zoology and learning about these small creatures and the zooplankton and the phytoplankton and this whole basis of the food web. And I tell my students, go where your curiosity leads you for as long as you possibly can. My senior thesis as an undergrad was on jellyfish and strobilation. So that's when they do this cool thing. Oh, that's what the poster is behind me. That is one of the life cycles of these jellies, moon jellies, Aurelia aurita, that, they go through this whole transformation process from being benthic to being in the water column, being pelagic. After that, I started working at the aquarium as an education naturalist, which I loved. Soon after we were doing live streams of the deep sea with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And I got to kind of stand up with a group of the public and just kind of talk off the top of my head about what they were seeing live, kind of down deep in the water column. And it was so fascinating and interesting. I ended up doing my master's while working at the aquarium with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And my advisor, Dr. Mary Silver, had been one of the people who had kind of co-discovered marine snow and this whole transport of nutrients from the surface to the deep ocean community.
I mean, snow like how it
Snow,
sinks. You can really, wow.
you can really see it in the water. It looks like snow. If you Google marine snow, it's all of the creatures at the surface that are maybe shedding or pieces of seaweed or molts from crabs. All the
You should put that
material.
in the show notes so people can actually jump right into it. So check out the show notes for more information about marine snow. That's the name, marine snow?
Yes.
And your mentor was the one that discovered or researched?
Yes, she and her friend from graduate school, Alice Aldridge, they really were the pioneers, pioneering oceanographers for their time in terms of women in science and women on expeditions, and just these brilliant women who noticed how much net transport there was of material from the surface to the deep, and that possibly this was just one of the major ways that our deep sea was getting nutrients. Simultaneously, when I was doing my master's, started taking the physical and chemical and biological oceanography classes to really understand the physics of our oceans, how the currents move. And that became just, I was just awestruck by how many small scale and large scale kind of forces there are operating at the same time in our oceans and influencing, not just the large gyres, but the smaller scale ocean circulation that we see that form, even nutrient profiles off Hawaii and off California, and influence upwelling and regimes where, you see whole entire food webs kind of changing because of the nutrient base there. At a certain point, I wanted to kind of get back onto land. Lots of good reasons for that, which might be for another podcast another day. And worked with John Pierce on my PhD on getting people, community members, out into the Intertidal. So it's a much more friendly place to visit than the deep sea. That was a wonderful partnership with him and California Sea Grant. I was a Sea Grant fellow. Created a program that's still going on today that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, National Marine Sanctuaries offices run, and I still work with them. on it. It's called limpets, but it's basically a long-term monitoring for intertidal and sandy beaches. And it's training for students and for teachers to go out in the intertidal and really collect data to learn how to do transects and quadrats. And our goal was to bring science kind of more to the general public and involve youth and teachers at community city colleges and universities, but also high school students. That's kind of the basics of my my career path. But I was very, very lucky to have mentors, Mary Silver, John Pierce, who were just not just wonderful scientists, but kind humans and curious also about the natural world, where you can have conversations about what you wonder and what you're noticing and what you see and why could that be this way and how could we test that and would that work? So that was kind of my scientific lens with the geology as well, kind of mindset. My thesis, my PhD, my dissertation was on the effects of rock type on intertidal ecology. And, in Hawaii and in California and in our coastal cities, we spend a lot of money armoring the coastline or putting rocks along the shoreline or other seawalls to fortify our coasts with global climate change and sea level rise. And so that was what I was looking at. How do those kind of changes in our intertidal communities affect the species that can grow on the different rocks?
Yeah, the interference of the humans, because we're trying to figure out how to make this work on the planet with the climate change. There's always change in the world, but you didn't specifically what it means for the intertidal and the species that live there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they like certain components to settle on. So our algae and mussels and barnacles and snails and lobsters and crabs, most of our anemones, intertidal invertebrates, don't just kind of have a baby that lands right next to them or have an offspring. They spew out their sperm and egg into the water column. It meets in the water column. They can time it to things like the sun and the moon and the tides to increase the chances of those gametes meeting. And then that fertilized egg, that larvae, moves around in the water column and is taken by the currents. It's completely at the will of the currents, if you will. It's not swimming against the current. These are often microscopic. And then at some point in their development, depending on maybe if they've had like some sort of yolk that helps them for a certain amount of time develop as they're floating, some of them do not, they have to find a place to choose or to, I shouldn't anthropomorphize them, but they need to find a place to settle and to start to attach and to live their life. And where they settle has everything to do with if they will succeed or not. And certain species like a certain texture, so we call that rugosity, a certain texture of the rock. Some in the intertidal, if the tide gets low during a hot summer day, the rock could get too hot for them. And a lot of times that's what happens. So when humans add, for example, basalt, black, it's usually black basalt, that gets too hot in a low tide summer kind of midday. And those larvae don't survive that heat, so they kind of sizzle. If they're too low in the intertidal, that's not good. If they're too high. So all of that was what I was just so curious about, and we need all of those species to have healthy intertidal zones and healthy subtidal zones and inevitably healthy manta rays as well. So it's all connected. All of our ocean ecosystems are completely connected with respect to nutrient exchange and food webs and species that are existing and biodiversity.
Yeah. And then, mind blowing, all the things you just said. Like, wow. And then there's a step further. the discussion that we must have to make this planet inhabitable, right? And continue to be, that we can live here to, as a species, the human species, right? And how important the ocean is to all of it. If we don't have the ocean the way it functions to this point, what happens? Tell me.
The health of our ocean is absolutely critical to human existence. And it's not just for people who live near the ocean and rely on the resources, the fish that they catch, or the, invertebrates that they eat, the abalone or the limpets or the crabs. The currents in the ocean are distributing nutrients around our globe. So we have these major sinks where our ocean waters, let's say in the North Atlantic, we have cold, salty water, and it sinks down to the bottom areas of the Atlantic. And then it moves throughout our ocean basins from the Atlantic all the way around to the Indian Ocean, where there's this kind of upwelling, and all the way down and around to the northern Pacific. And this is called our global ocean conveyor belt. And so it's this kind of thermohaline. It's temperature salinity driven circulation from the surface to depth. And what that does is it brings whatever's in that surface water down to depth. That deep ocean water, as it's flowing, gets that raining down, bringing back to our marine snow of all the nutrients from the surface down to that deep water. And it's really a way that our oceans are circulating oxygen, nutrients. And from the time it sinks in the North Atlantic, there are some smaller areas where it sinks off Antarctica. From the time it sinks in the North Atlantic till it comes up in the Pacific can be upwards of 2,000 years.
2000 years.
2,000 years. So we're talking about larger timescales than our one human lifespan. And oceanographers have been studying this for, decades now, and are understanding how important that ocean circulation is to kind of maintain nutrients movement throughout our global ocean basins and our surface waters. So that's another component. Then the other component is really the evaporation from our oceans that leads kind of the charge for our atmospheric circulation and our precipitation evaporation cycles that stem from our ocean system. Our Pacific Ocean around the equator and our Atlantic Ocean around the equator sees more evaporation. It's more sunny there. Our sunlight hits our planet kind of more directly at the equator than at the poles. And we see that. That's why it's generally warmer at the equator than at the poles. But that means that salt, that warmer kind of water is along the equatorial Pacific and Atlantic. But we also have more evaporation there. So it also tends to be slightly more salty than waters in other places. But that water that is evaporated there that goes into the clouds ends up coming as rain at 30 degrees north. And it really fuels this whole kind of atmospheric cycling of air and water. So our surface ocean is incredibly important to our atmospheric circulation. Another piece that we can forget is that off the coast of the East Coast is a current called the Gulf Stream that kind of comes right up and goes off the coast of New England across the Atlantic. And that's warm water from that equatorial Atlantic that kind of comes up and over. And if you look at cool pictures from satellites, you can see like little eddies of warm water that go off around and circle around the areas of the Gulf Stream. And oceanographers can study like the nutrient profiles in those and how those little warm water eddies affect nutrients. And you get these phytoplankton blooms. And the phytoplankton are all the plants in the ocean that, again, can be microscopic. People might never have seen them. We'll put in the show notes some images for you to look at of microscopic phytoplankton. These are things called diatoms and dinoflagellates and foraminifera and radiolarians, the coolest names ever. And they are this basis of plants in our food web that all the zooplankton feed on. So the zooplankton are shrimp and krill and jellyfish, jellies, small larval fish, if they're feeding as in their larval stages, feed on these zooplankton. And that current that goes up is the reason why Northern Europe isn't freezing cold all the time, because that warm water that goes across the Atlantic actually helps maintain the climate in Europe to have warmer temperatures than it would if that kind of current shut down. Those are just some things off the top of my head, but I could go on about how important our oceans are to people, even those living in deserts and not living anywhere near an ocean. The oceans are really our drivers of movement on our planet.
I mean, when we met, you were just inquiring as a customer for a group of students and then a developer. But for me, in my work, in my daily life, my work is bringing people that don't understand the big picture, or maybe don't have that knowledge of the big picture you just laid out. And Jacques Cousteau, didn't he say, it's like, if you don't love something, you cannot protect it, So in my work, it's always like I drive people to a place, or I provide this place, they sign up with us, to experience something truly wonderful with the manta rays, right? But then these questions come up, it's like, what is plankton? Is there enough plankton? Is this gonna? And so the curiosity of the customers we have is incredible. And I get the question quite often. It's like, are you marine biologist? And I'm like, no, engineer, not much knowledge on any of that. But I do know the manta rays, right? So I really enjoy this conversation about how big the picture actually is, to touch people's lives, to see what is needed for living on this planet. And
Yeah.
it's because you just said it's only touching on a few things. It's mind-blowingly big picture, isn't it? I mean, it's hard to grasp how big the picture actually is.
It really is hard to
Yeah.
grasp how
Yeah.
big it is. Especially, I mean, I've met people in my life who've never seen the ocean and see pictures and are completely fascinated and want to study oceanography. And I say, you keep going for it. You don't have to have seen it, swam in it to understand and to be curious about how does this all work? And it's all these processes that we learn more and more about as our technology gets better and better. So our satellite data now is so amazing in terms of what we can see. Our buoy system is so important to maintain funding for. We have buoys across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, and those systems are telling us every day, how sea surface height, the wind direction and speed, the air temperature. And from these kinds of data is how we make models of what potentially could change, what's happening. It's how we can see if maybe there's an El Nino coming. For me in this field, there's not a day that goes by that there's something that I can't learn that's new. So if that tells you how amazing and completely unbelievable this kind of oceanography field is, even me with all the papers that are coming out, there's always new things to learn about what we're seeing and noticing. And I love that about the mantas. So mantas are connectors. And this is why your specific knowledge about the mantas that you bring people to see is so important, because what I learned from you is there the coastal manta population, and then there's the pelagic manta kind of population. Correct me if I'm not remembering this right.
And now we have the third species described as the Atlantic manta ray, where the habitat is from Florida down to South America. In July 2025, the third species was described. How long it took, to be at the point that was described, and I believe it was a 10-year process. Dr. Andrea Marshall was the forefront of this research to have the second species, the Mobiloberostris. And then she also already said when she was describing that, she's like, there is a third one. And then last year that was all completed. So yeah, there's a difference between species and where they live and habitat.
And not only that, but if you can inspire, and you do, you inspire people who get to swim with and see these absolutely incredible beings. And that alone can live with people for so long that they stay connected to the ocean. They stay connected to the oceanography. So mantas are connectors, not just with people in the ocean because they're so majestic. They're so non-threatening. They're also, though, for our ocean, what we call, a keystone species, or one of those species that are incredibly important and tell us about the health of the entire ecosystem. And why is that? Because they are feeding on the basis of our food chain, on the phytoplankton, on the zooplankton. And so they are indicators that, okay, there's enough nutrients, there's enough kind of basis of our food chain that other species are going to be okay. But in addition, they're migrating between different areas, between different feeding grounds, and they are also transporting nutrients. So as they eat and then they poop and pee, their excretion into the water is putting nutrients in another place. So that could be used to fertilize coral, to fertilize a little zooplankton bloom. And the fact that they're filtering out zooplankton, they're constantly kind of looking for places to eat, but they are, one of those species that we could call them a vertical mixer. They're mixing nutrients in the water column because they can go to deeper areas as well, and bring up those nutrients to sunny surface waters where they get used up very quickly by phytoplankton as they're photosynthesizing. The phytoplankton is similar to plants, so they're just using the energy from the sunlight and turning that into carbon in their own body and energy. So with chlorophyll, different chlorophyll pigments, they're just one of those connector species between humans and the ocean and how we're all linked, but also within maintaining nutrient cycling in our oceans.
So the question I get a lot is, what is plankton? And I have this generic answer. It's the smallest form of marine life in the ocean. Is this the right answer? So my question is actually, what is plankton? And you said 2 different kinds.
Yes.
And the second question is usually, do manta rays care? And which one comes to the light? So the manta rays have a nice dinner.
Okay, so 2 kinds of plankton. Planktos in Greek means to drift or to wander. So plankton overall means anything that's drifting in the water column that cannot propel itself against a current. So people used to put some animals in there that aren't, because if they want to, they can move against a current. The opposite is nekton. Nekton are animals that swim. So we think of sharks, mantas, tuna. They're swimming and they're migrating long distances. Plankton, as an oceanographer, these are things that are stuck in an ocean current. So we can kind of see them on satellites. A plankton bloom would be in an area of where you can see kind of, it's going with the current. So there's the 2 kinds are phytoplankton, plant plankton. So these are photosynthesizers. So those are our diatoms, dinoflagellates are some of the common names. They are plants that are floating in the water. They cannot propel themselves against a current, although they can kind of spin around. Some of them have little flagella, so they can kind of spin around. But if they're in, like, let's say the California current off the coast of California, they're not going to end up moving somewhere where they are far off the current. They stay within the current. So they're entrained is the word we use. Then there's zooplankton, like a zoo, the animal plankton. And mantas filter feed massive amounts of usually the plankton in their gill rakers or gill slits. Do you call it both either?
We call it gill rakers, yeah.
Gill rakers. So it's kind of like a broom that, broom kind of things that come down within their head structure. Zooplankton, all the animals, plankton, they're all small, but phytoplankton are smaller. So zooplankton eat the phytoplankton. The zooplankton are the copepods, the shrimp, the crab larvae, fish eggs. And then when the mantas swim with their mouth open using that word you taught me, the cephalic.
They use the cephalic fins?
Cephalic fins. And they can funnel it. They're just so amazing. They can funnel that plankton right in to their mouth over their gill rakers. And that's what they're feeding on. And so when you turn on the light, the copepods, the shrimp, those are all attracted to the light, sometimes because the phytoplankton end up coming to the light. During the day, the sun is out, the phytoplankton is photosynthesizing, the zooplankton is kind of at the surface, moving around. All of this is generally microscopic. This is why it's so incredible that I had to be in college and use the microscopes and do these plankton toes, and bring it back to the lab and look. And then there's a whole world under the microscope. And I swear my superpower, if I could ever have one, would be to have microscopic eyes so I could see everything that I wanted to that was so small, because it's so incredible. And their forms, some of the shrimp have like big spikes to kind of deter larger zooplankton from eating them. Even the phytoplankton have these bristles that come out to kind of try to deter certain zooplankton from eating them. It's like a little war, just we can't see it with our naked eyes. So you have to, either look on videos of people who have recorded it under a microscope, or see it for yourself under a microscope. Yeah, it's fascinating.
And then when we turn on the lights, is it because there is a little swirl, like a little current within that area, that the plankton, either vital or zooplankton, is drawn there? Because they cannot go against the current, right? So how do they get to the light?
So when you turn on the artificial lights, it's attracting, sometimes during the day, phytoplankton and zooplankton can go down in the water column. So what's happening is along the reef at the Mauna Kea, there's currents that are kind of going in and out depending on what your tide is doing. I mean, this is something that we could study at some point, like measuring where the current is each night. And you could see, like, we could do phytoplankton and zooplankton toes and try to see, like, is there a difference in the amount of phytoplankton or zooplankton based on what we're measuring the current is doing and the tide is doing that day? Because the light is attracting the phytoplankton. And I said they can't swim, they can't, but like I also said, they do kind of have, some of them, flagellae. They have oil droplets in their body that they can kind of regulate moving up and down. So what's happening is they're actually kind of moving up in the water column. They're moving a little bit over in the currents as they're moving through that little area where you swim in. And that's attracting the zooplankton. I would also love to know, and maybe mantas on their gill rakers. Has anyone sampled what's on their gill rakers to see, is there phytoplankton stuck there? Is it just zooplankton?
I don't have that answer. I would not know. We can dive into this and do a little research. But I read a lot of stuff that comes out about the mantas, but haven't seen that one.
They're eating everything. They're unintentionally eating anything that can get caught in their sieve. They're eating plankton, but they're probably eating zooplankton and the phytoplankton.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. I'm so glad that you really nailed it down. And that will be my answer moving forward when the guest asks. You always say, I'm so curious. I wanted to dive deeper into a topic. And because the curiosity that comes through your life, it never stops. And I think that's a really, really good message for everybody. It's like, just stay curious,
Yes.
And there's so much to learn. And You're in this field for how much? 35 years? 30 years?
I got my PhD in 2005. Oh my gosh, 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I got my PhD, but I feel like I've been madly in love with the ocean since I can remember.
35 years.
Yeah.
Try not to stump over age here.
Yeah. My whole life. 35 years.
That's right. But stay curious, if we have the younger listeners to this and the older ones. I mean, I really want everybody to come to the point as soon as possible. We all can be the activists and have the curiosity to make the best decisions for sustainable living on this planet.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you could hear my process of thinking of a question for, Martina to look at in terms of currents and plankton and tows. Don't ever feel like everything is known already. It's not. And I've had some teachers that have kind of given me that message over the years, and it's just not true. There's so much out there to know and discover and to witness and to wonder about. Keep your curiosity going and don't ever feel like we know everything about a certain topic, because we just don't. We just don't yet. There's so much more to learn.
I mean, as environmentalists, we're both environmentalists. We always have that eye, what is happening around us in nature. And, I talk to folks about the disconnect, because a lot of technology out there, a lot of fantasy movies, because it's not the real world. But for me, it's kind of like we humans, we created over the last 100 years a life that for the most part, stay safe or less safe. I mean, I don't want to go into a place where I talk about politics, but we as humans, there's a lot of them on the planet. And I would like to focus on, like, if you have curiosity, use your curiosity to learn about how to sustainably live with all of us and with the environment, nature, the animals, everything, and have that as a forefront thought, the first thought, versus like, what is our species getting out of it? So that's just always my hope for the work I do for so long.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because all of the species contribute to our overall biodiversity on the planet. And time again, what we've learned is that areas of our ocean and of our land that have more biodiversity are more resilient to change over time. They're more resilient to, any sort of disease sweeping through. And there are connections between species, mantas and other species that ones that we know about in terms of, nutrients and nutrient cycling that they are so important for. But there's also ones that we still don't know about, these connections between, potentially the fish that live with them, the remoras, that attach. And there's just so many layers to each species that if you kept going in terms of why they're important would probably lead to us in some capacity. But even for maintaining healthy ecosystems, they are each so important.
Environmental has to be healthy, and we have to make sure we make it sustainable for everybody involved. That's the message. And so now you're the professor at a university, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
then that tied into your career that you eventually had then the 2005 PhD. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And then you went to be, see, I didn't go to school here in America, so there's a lot of things I don't have the right words for, but eventually you got a job to teach.
Yes.
Is this how things connected?
Yes.
And then
I had a very busy 5 years. I did my PhD and my master's at University of California, Santa Cruz. Our mascot is the banana slugs, ghost slugs, invertebrate. So that's an animal without a backbone. So yeah, it was great. And got a job teaching at the University of California, Santa Barbara with Alice Aldridge. So Mary and Alice were the two snow sisters, they called themselves. So they were the ones that figured out marine snow and transport of nutrients from the surface to the deep. And I was teaching biological oceanography. But during my PhD, I got married, I had 2 kids, and I got divorced. So I was quite busy. And I applied for numerous jobs, and I wanted to stay in Santa Barbara, being near the ocean. So I got a job at Antioch University. And now I teach online master's and PhD students in environmental studies. So I have students, and we have like low residency. So even though I live in Santa Barbara, most of the faculty are in New Hampshire at our campus there. But our students are around the globe. And so I've worked with students who looked at narwhals in Svalbard and very like North Atlantic area. I've had students that did acoustics in manatees in Belize. I've had students who have looked at fishing practices off California. I have students who did advocacy campaigns for salmon. So salmon are another connector between ocean and land and, distributing nutrients. So now I do that full time. And
just a moment.
Yeah.
Just you saying that you have students worldwide, my head is like exploding because it's all connected. And in your work, you're connecting the world to take care or keep studying the ocean and the ocean that sustains us, So it just makes my heart like, oh, this is so cool.
I know.
I didn't know that when we talked before for 2 hours. And
Yes.
how widespread your influence is. I think the listeners will feel your joy in your work and getting all your smiles, and you spread that into all your classes and to the students. So I'm just like, awesome.
My students, I call them my students. Any student that I have, I learn so much from teaching, and I think that's why I appreciate it as a career so much. Constantly humbled by terminology changes that I need to learn and ways to be more inclusive and making sure there's ways that Indigenous voices are being heard. My graduate students are generally, it's an environmental science studies, program. So it's very interdisciplinary. And this has been a great growing curve for me because of my training was so science-based, and I should use the term Western or modern science-based. So data heavy, looking at numbers and values and buoy data and oceanographic satellite data and counting species in the field and quadrats and transects. In my work with graduate students, because it's an interdisciplinary program, this is where we have components of like service learning, where students need to give back to their community in some way during their PhD and create a project proposal and do something like, really do something that helps with environmental education where they are. And because they're everywhere, I get to learn about all these different places and issues. I have a student in Tennessee, and there's a river there I had no idea about that's having issues with pollutants, and she's advocating for it. So I'm really learning a lot from my students. The classes I teach are things like Indigenous knowledge systems and global environmental change and earth systems and climate change, conservation biology, applied ecology. And I have students, when we're doing it online, we meet in person or like this, synchronously on Zoom every other week. And I have them go out and do studies where they are. So when they come and present, I get to learn about all these different habitats and what they found and what species there are. And so I guess it was eye-opening for me to, at first I was concerned not teaching face-to-face because that was what I did really early in my career pre-pandemic. But we wanted to have it more accessible, this master's PhD, more accessible to people around the globe. And it's just amazing, and it's so rich, and it makes our knowledge of biodiversity that much bigger. And then I'm a lecturer at a local university here in Santa Barbara, the University of California, Santa Barbara. And so I teach environmental studies major students, and I teach, actually one class I teach is really a GE class. So it's the science of environmental science. So it's all about biogeochemical cycles and introducing students to the global ocean conveyor belt and plankton and phytoplankton. So that's in person, 600 student class. And then I teach conservation planning to teach students how to find an issue and go through a process of creating a plan to change it. And that's like a very active, really fun class. And then I teach applied ecology, where I also have them do a project. So I've put kind of my values and beliefs into all my classes, which is hands-on. You have to do something. As hard as it might be in 10 weeks or in 12 weeks, they do projects in all my classes, and they get that kind of field experience, which I really value for them.
Yeah. Everything you say, I love everything you do and say and bring to the world. I mean, you really, really bring a lot to the world, and
I try.
I appreciate it all so much. You just said, I have a question as from a European perspective. And I grew up in Europe, environmental studies, it was just so much more prevalent. I mean, which is normal for us to think that way. When I came to the United States almost 30 years ago, there was this complete shock where I'm like, you guys really need to catch up here in America on just the thinking, right? You have these worldwide students, and they have their project. And then you mentioned Tennessee, where there is the problem with pollution, right? Is there a shift in America to catch up on what Europe has always been already for, 30, 40 years, right?
I think there are definitely pockets of areas that are catching up, that focus on environmental issues and farming and eating local and growing local and using less water. There's pockets of that all over the United States. Really amazing examples of small groups of people making huge changes. I think in elementary schools, in certain places, there's a lot of focus on our environment, and school garden projects that have gotten funded in some of the schools in this county have been really, really helpful for young students. But then I do feel like some of that kind of slides away in high school. There's like environmental studies in California, AP environmental studies type courses that are great. But in terms of students kind of getting out and living a little bit differently, I think we have a long way to go for that with the general public. I went to Amsterdam maybe 3 years ago, and it did just feel differently in terms of the food, the markets, where the food was coming from. Even when I was asking, like we were in the city, but I was asking where some of the produce came from. And, a mile away, there's gardens, and we have that. Again, there's pockets of that. So my town, I'm very lucky, my town has a lot of local farmers and farmland. It is being quite rapidly transitioning into housing complexes. So I'm a little bit worried about that. But I want to say we have some way to go. And there's pockets of hope. And I kind of rely on those pockets of hope to keep us with kind of a barometer of where we want to be.
Simultaneously, I have to say, as an activist myself for so long in the environmental space, and now do other things too, the Americans are on it now. I think because activism is activated in the citizens of the United States, we have to figure out a few other things first, I guess, just from a form of government, I guess, what we want to continue to do or not to do. My connection is always is like, if we activate the citizens and we understand that policies are important to make the real change, because we are a country with the rule of law, and There's a society built on that. And if the rules say local food has to be sold first, for example, I don't even know if that's going to happen, but policies have to be in place.
That's right.
And I said that actually maybe, I think it was about 12 years ago when I got solar on the roof. It was, for me, it was so clear that I have to get solar living in Hawaii. And that was also a shock value because I left Germany with friends already having solar on the roof in 1998 or 2000. And I come to Hawaii and then I'm like, nobody has solar here. So I was an early adopter in Hawaii to get solar on the roof. And I thought, if the Americans really figure out there's not infinite availability of resources, there will be a shift. And let's dedicate the next 10 years. Everybody, if 10% of the country, hopefully 20% or 30%, but if I can have my guests leave the manta ray experience and they say, I want this to succeed, I want this to be sustainable, maybe 10 years of your life could be spent on activism for the right policies, for the environment, et cetera, then American people will turn this thing around. And with that, the whole planet. We'll see. But we'll see what happens. But this is my hope, I guess, believe in the good. And it's more about an awakening to see the big picture. And the information is all there. It just needs to be connected.
And having them have magical experiences like swimming with the mantas, something you don't forget about that becomes visceral part of your body ecosystem is like, there are things out there that need my help. What can I do right now here? And it can be something very little, eating locally, riding my bike when I can. All of those little things make a difference. I really believe in that modeling what we want to see. And advocacy is more and more important for people. And that's where I feel like my job is also to make sense of scientific information and make, global climate change kind of palatable to people, and the stronger storms and the stronger rain, kind of the rainfall like amount for a shorter period of time. Like even that is an example of climate changing. And any people that I talk to, I just try to have the conversations about the information and talk about it and answer questions. And there's often things that I don't know, and just saying, I don't know that. Let's look that up and let's figure out who knows that. Trying to make the scientific messaging as clear as possible is also one of my goals.
Fantastic. I do want to tie something back what you mentioned earlier, and that you are an advisor to the Northern Chumash Tribal Council. And I want to hear about that.
So 12, maybe 15 years ago now, I was working, and I'm still an advisor for an organization. We can put it in the show notes, the Tribal Trust Foundation. And it's a nonprofit that works to kind of elevate Indigenous voices. And we have become a fiscal sponsor for many Indigenous groups that don't have necessarily a 501c3 or the ability to get one in the States. And so people can make donations, have it be a tax write-off, and then we can give the money to these Indigenous groups to advocate and do work that they need to do. And I was invited to Tulum, Mexico, and I had always read about it. The ocean currents there are really interesting, to meet with the Maya people. And they have an issue with plastic on the beaches. And I can tell you that there was plastic bottles and shoes and containers up to here in some areas walking on the beach. I had never seen anything like it. They were talking about how it makes it impossible to use the beach. And in addition, they can't anymore get to the beach because in Tulum, there's kind of resort after resort after resort, and they have kind of closed off some of the public access points. So I was supporting their voices and figuring out if there's anything we could do about all of that plastic trash. And it turns out it comes in on the Atlantic current. It's dumped out at sea by rivers that take water from land, and that's kind of washed into the ocean, potentially by ocean dumping as well. And because of the current right there, it just kind of dumps right on that beach on that Yucatan Peninsula. So it was a big problem, which started advocacy campaigns and joining like the Five Gyres group to kind of try to curb this. But what I learned from working with them is just how incredibly smart Indigenous groups are, how marginalized in terms of what tables they're invited to speak at, where they're able to physically, because of safety, go to advocate. And that started a journey for me of being open to kind of being an ally and supporting Indigenous voices. We, Tribal Trust, really only go where Indigenous people have invited us to participate. So the next invitation was to Bhutan, and this is a Himalayan nation, not near the ocean at all. But remember my connection of land and sea. And so I figured this looks like a magical place. I'd never go there, because it's not on my radar. Let's go and let's figure this out. Well, the Himalayas are incredibly important for atmospheric processes. It's our tallest mountains, and we have monsoons, incredible weather systems because of those mountains, downpouring rain, drier spells, incredible water that comes down that feeds all of the lower laying areas and creates much fertility for land to grow crops. Incredibly important connection from the Himalayas to the ocean where rivers come out. The indigenous group, the first people of Bhutan, were the Monpa. And the first time I visited, there's an elder. He's the medicinal healer, Aptaula. And he sat and said, I want you all to come. I want you to write a book on my medicinal plant knowledge. This is from centuries of being passed down from person to person. And I said, I'm a marine biologist. I don't know how I'm going to help you be able to, yes, I can take down all the information and I can write the book with you, but how is that going to help? It'll help. It'll help. So I just kept believing. And I loved it so much there that I took my kids out of school and I moved there for 6 months and taught at the Royal Thimphu College in Bhutan. And they were with me. So we were there.
You're incredible. You're incredible.
The only Americans, made some great friends, absolutely loved it, and worked on this book and realized that every time I showed up at their village, people would kind of come around and listen to what we had multiple interpreters because he spoke Monka. The national language of Bhutan is Dzongkha, and I speak English. And so I had multiple interpreters. I had to be very careful about how I was asking things, and I learned so much in this process. Their language hadn't even been documented. They are doing that now. There's a group from Australia who got a grant to do that. And so I would write down everything. He'd show me the plants. He'd tell me a little bit about how he prepared them. And then I would watch him treat people. So they would come, their wrist hurt, they got burned, they had a headache, they had whatever it was, he would treat them. A cow hurt their ankle, he would treat them. Someone got a snake bite, he would treat them. So I was just watching. But every time, as I said, I showed up to take all my notes, and then we got the National Biodiversity Center involved in working with him. People from the village would listen and watch. And when I was ready and I had the draft of the book and I showed him, I said, now I see. So every time I come, people want to hear what you have to say. And he said, yeah. And now I have 5 people who I'm training to learn from me. And before you started coming, no one really wanted to learn. They thought, and I keep telling them, I'm dead up to here. He would point to his knees. I'm not going to make it forever, but people were, busy. They had just gotten electricity in the village. A few of them had cell phones. They had other priorities, and his priority was to get people he could mentor. And now I'm going back in September they want another book on their cultural connection to the environment. So that was kind of my introduction to those experiences. And then it led to working with the Shuar in Ecuador and supporting Tuntiak Katan is his name, really an amazing advocate for the Shuar. He was the first Indigenous person to speak at a UN climate conference. Through all of this, when my kids were really little, I think it was because of them. They were so curious and sweet kids. We were invited to participate in what we call the Chumash Tomal crossing. So I sit on Chumash lands, unceded Chumash territory. So there's multiple bands here in California. Some are state and some are federally recognized. And they do in their wood plank tomals a crossing to their islands, the Channel Islands. So Limu is Santa Cruz Island. From here, they would paddle across. And we started camping over there with them and just learning and listening. And before really we had the terminology of like ally or allyship, I just listened. And if there was anything I could do to support their mission, I did. That's how the work with the Northern Chumash, they were advocating for a sanctuary, Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. And it's from just north of where I live all the way up about an hour and a half north of here. And it was designated. It was finally designated in November of 2024, the first Indigenous-led National Marine Sanctuary in the U.S. And so for 8 years, I supported them in their sanctuary campaign, which was incredibly well done. And it looked like a lot of different things: field trips, partnerships, curriculum development, press releases, showing up at events, helping at events, lots of different things. But that sanctuary happened. It is in place. And tomorrow I have my first in-person meeting. I am on the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council. So NOAA has advisory councils for all of their sanctuaries, which are members of the public who will advise them on all things. I am a research seat, so that means talking about the research that is happening and potentially should be happening. And my goal is to learn about how the indigenous voices of the various tribes hope to be all the programs that they would like to see, and help advocate for that.
The work you do with indigenous tribes, it's absolutely beautiful. And I wonder, is there any other indigenous groups you have a connection to, or is that in California the only one? Or well,
there is a group in Miloli, south of Kona, about 45 minutes south of Kona.
Yeah, on our island.
They are an unincorporated community, and they have a sign in their community called the Last Hawaiian Fishing Village. And I had the absolute privilege of bringing students this summer to work with them. So there are some community leaders there. They do a kids summer camp where they're teaching them all about traditional Hawaiian language and fishing methods and art and oceanographic concepts. But they have created within themselves the first community-based subsistence fishing area down in their area. And they have various regulations that they've put in place there for fishing at a certain time or a certain size of fish depending on spawning or reproductive cycles. They have their own regulations, but they also do their own enforcement. So they have people that work to enforce these regulations. Mainly it's when boats would come down maybe from Kona to do fishing. But they have so much knowledge that I learned when we were there about the water that's coming from the mountains to the ocean and how much freshwater input there is into their kind of coral reef area and how it changes over time depending on the season. What we did was continue their monitoring program. So they are, in several of their beaches, they look at fish species and measure the size of the fish along transects. And then with quadrats, so with like measured areas, they look at the health of the coral and they look at the urchins and some of the other invertebrates. And so they're comparing those data over time to see what's changing. It's an amazing community. They're doing great work. They're supporting youth in their area. And I encourage people to learn more about that, Miloli. And there's a nonprofit that you can support. We can put in the show notes as well.
Definitely show notes. And then it sounds like it is the full circle. That's how we met. That was the reason for you to come to the islands. You brought your group of students. And then you were like, well, I want to bring those students to see the manta rays. And here we are. So
that's beautiful. Exactly right. That's what I was doing there, working with this group. Yep.
Yeah. I'm so glad all the connections you have and we can expand on. I might just reach out to them and through you and bring them on the podcast, tell about what locally is happening on the island. And there's a lot of people that do a lot of good work, and maybe I can be that outlet to bring more information to.
Yes, because they're also doing work with coral restoration, and they have a whole Opelu traditional management zone where they have like no take of Opelu except for hook and line for certain months. And they're just incredible advocates and ocean scientists with their knowledge. They know so much about their area. And they prohibit certain things, aquarium fishing, crab eggs at certain times, limits on take. Yeah, it's incredible.
Oh, the indigenous have it figured out. They were here way before us.
Way before
us colonializing this the world. And these are interesting times where things will be shifting, and we will always look back to them for the knowledge that they have in them for centuries.
And looking for partnerships, how to support them, how to get their mission out there, what we can do to be allies, and working together. It's all so important.
But it's incredible where your curiosity from child to where you thought the ocean is just my space, and then you go to the Himalayan mountains and how a life journey is forged, and how many beautiful things are happening. That all the stories you tell us under the story that your life is very impactful. Seeing the depth of your work. And before that, you asked me all the questions too. And I was actually almost apologized because I didn't realize how much knowledge is behind you. But I also have to say in my work, there are only two things really important. I do this for so long and guests come and I'm always asking two questions. Do you know how to swim? Have you snorkeled before? Because for the manta rays, that's the most important part. So keep that environment healthy and sustainable, that we as the humans don't interfere with that trying to do, right? So I have lots and lots of customers over the years that probably have incredible life path and stories to tell, but I'm really, really glad you laid it all out today because it's incredible what you do.
And when we first spoke, you realize it takes all of us. It takes someone like you who's doing these podcasts and bringing people every day that it's possible to swim with the mantas, to get more people on the side of being in love with the ocean. That's when they'll work to protect it. And then your knowledge of each one was so fantastic. It was like they were your friends. You knew where they go and where they eat and how old they were. And I just think we need all of it in our future. And there isn't sometimes time to understand what like all of your visitors do. And maybe that's something cool you could ask, your visitors about because even like a business person, right? We need business people. Maybe you have a lobbyist who you've had, come on your tour. It literally takes all of us with all these interdisciplinary strengths to work together to protect our earth and ocean resources. I've been in such the Western science world. It's my framing, but as I've learned and grown, it's everyone. It's you.
What a wonderful conversation again, And I always want to encourage, I want to get the voices of the customers onto my podcast. There's a psychologist said to me, Manta's superpower, you spoke about superpowers earlier. Manta's superpower is pushing trauma into gear, there's something happens inside of us, and I'm always glad to talk about this aspect of my work, because I bring people from a state of mind where like, who signed me up for this? I'm intimidated to go into the dark ocean, to absolute awe and wonder of these feelings when they come out. So that's an aspect. But then the other aspect is, it's like, what do we do with that feeling or with that knowledge? And I want to encourage anyone that is on my tours to also reach out to me and say, hey, this is my journey and I want to share it too. And I would be honored to have lots and lots of episodes with my former customers, because on the grassroots level is where we will reach people and will make a difference. As it says, meaningful change, right? The meaningful change is like, so the podcast is a wonderful outlet to bring this kind of information and encouragement and curiosity to many. Thank you so much for joining us today. If this was an episode that inspired you, keep coming back, subscribe, get on our newsletter. I try to keep everybody up to speed on what's happening in the manta world. So thank you for joining today, Dawn. And until next time.
Thank you
Aloha.
for having me, Martina. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us on Ocean Wings. If this episode moved you, inspired you, or made you think, please follow and share it with someone who cares about conservation and making meaningful change. Want to learn more or experience the magic of manta rays? Get in touch at oceanwingspodcast.com and subscribe to our emails for more stories from the ocean. Tune in next week for another episode. Until then, keep swimming with purpose. Aloha.